Let's talk about becoming the new leader of a worship ministry, or maybe it taking over the responsibility from someone else. Maybe you just started at that church and you're coming in from the outside. Maybe you were already going to that church and the current leader stepped down. If I was in that position, here are some of the things that I would focus on. And I actually was in that position about 4 years ago now at my current church. I started at this church. I came in from the outside back in 2020. And honestly, I didn't really have much to take over here because there wasn't much existing in the form of structure at my current church, so I kind of had to build it from the ground up. But this church has been around for a while, so there's always that feeling of coming into something that's already established, whether that's a worship team or just the ministry of the church life itself. And so here are some things that I did, and also maybe some things that I would do, speaking from experience now, some lessons that I learned. The first thing that I would do, and that I did do whenever I first started at this church, is it's got to start here, all right? You come in and you're like, I see this that I want to change. I see this that I want to change. Why do they do things this way? And you see like this, all of a sudden you have this list in your head of like 100 things where you're like, I need to change that, and that. But before you get to doing that list, the most important thing that you need to do is to build relationships with the people there. You can only make minimal changes at best if you don't have a relationship with the people of the church. And so your first priority for the first 6 months, maybe even to a year, should be building relationships with the people who are currently on the worship team. How do you do that? Well, the question is, how do you do that with anybody, I guess? And I think to just boil it down to its simplest form, I mean, there's specific things that you can do, I guess, but to boil it down to its simplest form is just to simply spend time with people. How are you going to build a relationship with anybody in your life? You say, hey, let's get together and spend time together. And so, for instance, at this church, when I first started, there were some guys who were in charge of the sound team, the tech team at my church, and I wanted to build a relationship with them. So the one guy owns a tire shop, and very quickly, whenever I first started here, I was like, hey, I want to come out and hang out with you at the tire shop. And so I literally went to his tire shop, and I remember that he had like these camping chairs, and he opened up the garage, and we just sat there for like an hour and a half and just talked. And now, 4 years later, him and I have a great relationship, and I know that it started from that one simple act of, hey, can I just spend some time with you? So look for things like that, or just go out for coffee with people. And there is something to be said for group settings. I think that we need to do that as well. I think that's good to establish not just one-on-one relationships, but also group relationships. So you can have like a team night, maybe just get together, not even you're gonna have worship rehearsals every week or whatever. So you're gonna see these people all the time. But to plan something outside of that, where you're not focused on music and it's just like, let's get together for dinner sometime, or let's get together for a game night. And in those moments, I feel like that's when I've built relationships with people. It's not just serving with them on a Sunday morning, although that does help, and that probably forms like the foundation of most of our relationship with that person. But it's always those moments outside of just the normal church gathering, I feel like, where you're just getting together as people, that the deeper relationships form. So do it with your team, but also do it on a one-to-one basis and actually get to know the people of the ministry that you're stepping into. Now, here's why that's important, like I said, because without those relationships, you can't make much change in your church. And why is that? It's because people aren't going to trust you. They're going to be like, here comes this new guy who comes into the worship ministry and just thinks that he knows everything and wants to change everything. As opposed to somebody taking a year to get to know people, and we're not doing it to manipulate them, by the way. This is like, we should actually be building relationships with the people of our church. I'm not like saying, just build relationships so that you can make the changes that you want, but build actual relationships with them. And then as you have that relational currency where people trust you, then they can see that you care for them. And when you make the suggestion, hey, let's get rid of our music stands, if you just came in and did that at the beginning, whenever you came into the worship ministry, they would be like, there's no way I'm doing that. We haven't done that for the 10 years I've been here. Why would I start doing that now? But whenever you build that relationship, there I said that word like a million times now, you can talk to them not just as a dictator of, I'm coming in and I'm going to make these changes, but you can talk to them as somebody who knows them, and you can have a normal conversation and say, hey guys, I'm thinking about us trying to get rid of the music stands on the stage because of X, Y, and Z, and so I want to implement it slowly over time, so let's just try one song at worship rehearsal. And what might have been an extremely offensive conversation in the past now becomes I trust Spencer. I know him now, so let me maybe give that a shot. So the first thing, build relationships, and I spent a lot of time on that because that is the most important thing that you can do. Number 2 is to move slower than you think you need to. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I know you come in and you see a million things that you want to change, but just have a long-term mindset, okay? You aren't there to just come in and shake a million things up unless there's like egregious heresy or something. But if it's like, hey, I want my team to memorize their music, or hey, I want to implement click tracks into our worship gathering, or I want to try this new song, whatever it is, move slower than you think you should. Even if you think, okay, after like 3 months, we're probably good, maybe just you can try it and see how it feels, and if it feels like you get a bunch of pushback, just know things take longer than you think they do. When I started at this church, I had some things that I wanted to change, and we didn't even have a pastor at the time, so it was even more difficult to change some things up because we didn't have a pastor to lead that change. And so I made small tweaks here and there for like the first year, and then we got a pastor, but now I'm waiting for him to become established in the church, and that probably takes another year. So it was probably, for me, it was like 2 years before we started making changes in our church, like meaningful changes in the church. And you have to think about the people who were there before you got there. Just remember, they have been at that church for, in my case, it was like some people had been here for like 50 years, and they were like, we've always done things this way, and now here's this new person coming in. Why should I trust them? And I don't blame them for that. I would probably feel the same way. But once you've established yourself there and they actually trust you and they see that you have their best interest in mind and you want what's best for them and you want to help them mature as a believer in Christ, then they will start to trust you, and you can start to offer these changes that you'd like to see and explain why you're making the changes. But it takes longer than you think it does, so don't just come in and think I'm going to make 45 changes in 1 year and then everything will be how I want it. Now, the third thing I would do if I was taking over a worship ministry, and this goes along with everything I've talked about so far, is to choose your battles wisely. There are things that maybe even as soon as we come into the church, we should deal with. Like I said, if there are egregious problems in the church, we need to deal with those right away, because I'm not going to perpetuate an egregious problem just because I'm waiting to build relational currency with the congregation. But I would say that those egregious problems are probably not 99.5% of the problems. So if you run into something in your church that's like, I don't like that, but I mean, it's not the end of the world, then you've got to prioritize the changes that you're going to make. Because I talked about relational currency before. Every time you spend relational currency, you have less of it. And so, especially at the beginning, eventually you get to a point where, okay, I know these people, they know me, and you can make a bunch of changes because you have this fortune of relational currency. But until you have that, you've got to spend it wisely. And so I'm just thinking of some of the things that we did at my church, and this wasn't like all me necessarily. There were other people making these changes in the church, but even like renovating our worship space, we went from pews to chairs. Like, that's an example of a change where it's like, do we need to do that? Not necessarily. Can we do that? We can. Should we? Well, we need to update the worship space, so do we want pews or chairs? But I wasn't even thinking about renovating the church when I came in, because that wasn't really my responsibility. But if I came into a church and it was like, should we continue to sing all of these songs that have horrible theology? Or should we change the pews to chairs? Where would I be spending my relational currency? I'd be spending it right here, because that's a bigger change. So I'm just saying, prioritize the changes that you want to make and be honest with yourself. Is this really that big of a problem? Is it really that big of a problem that people don't have their music memorized? Is it really that big of a problem that we don't use click tracks? No, it's not. This might be nice to have in the future, but the church has survived doing those things or without those things for a long time. It's not going to destroy the church to not have that for a little while longer. So choose your battles wisely. Now, after you have spent a lot of time and moved slowly, and I'm not even 100% sure if I was coming into an existing worship ministry, I don't want to give like a hard timeline when I would do this next thing, but at some point you need to implement expectations for your worship team. And by that I mean have a worship team quote unquote code of conduct. I call mine a worship ministry overview, but it's essentially a code of conduct. And if you don't have one of those, then check out down in the description below the worship team toolkit. In that worship team toolkit, I've got my worship team code of conduct that you can pretty much just take and copy and paste right into your own worship ministry. I've also got my worship team application form there. So when people are interested in joining the new worship team that you are leading, you can have them fill that out first and it'll set the expectations before they even join the team. But you need expectations because at some point, you've got to define this is how we act as a worship team. And like I said, I don't think this is something you come in right away necessarily and say, hey, I'm going to be implementing this new worship team code of conduct. But I think if I were to do it, and like I said, I didn't really have to do it necessarily here because there wasn't an existing worship team when I started here, but I would probably spend like those first 6 months or so to a year maybe building relationships with people and slowly implementing those expectations just in a verbal form to the team. And then maybe after I'd been there for a year, after that first year, I'd be like, hey, I've been here for a year now, and I feel like over this past year, we've identified these things as things that we want to commit to as worship team members, and so I've just typed them up. You guys already know these because we've talked about it over this past year. This is more so for new people coming in, but this is kind of where I feel like we've landed over this past year, so I want to put it down in written form so that new people who join the team understand how to function as a worship team member whenever they come into the team. That's probably how I would frame that. And that way it's not like, I think the danger with doing it right whenever you come into a worship ministry is what I talked about before, where you're like, okay, I've got a million changes that I want to implement. And if you say this is a code of conduct or whatever you want to call it, and you hand it to people, now it's like, hey, I don't know you, you don't know me, but I'm the new leader and I'm coming in and these are all of the changes that we're going to make that you now have to abide by. As opposed to building that relationship over a period of time, slowly implementing all of those changes that you want over that first year and beyond, and then saying, hey, here are the things that we've worked at over the years. See the difference between the two? But long story short, you do need that in some capacity. So if you've been at your church for a year now and you have some sort of relationship with the people on your team, consider checking out that worship team toolkit. Like I said, I'll link it down in the description below. And then one more encouragement to you as you step into this new leadership position, just understand that it takes time. I've kind of hinted at that throughout this whole video, but to see the changes that you want to see in a new ministry, it takes time because of all the things that I talk about, because you have to build relationships with people, because you have to choose your battles wisely, and you can't just fight all of your battles at once because people don't trust you until you're there for 2 or 3 years and they see, number one, that you're trustworthy, that you care about them, number 3, that you're actually going to stick around. And people often say it takes like 7 years before you're actually established at a church and people trust you completely and see you as their leader. For me, like I said, I've been at this church for like 4 years now, and I feel like I'm just finally starting to see that. I don't think I'm 100% of the way there yet, but I know for a fact that people at my church now trust me a whole lot more than they did when I first started here 4 years ago. And I feel fairly confident, depending on a change that I would make, which I don't even really have that many like huge changes left that I would like to make at my church. I feel fairly confident that if done the right way, people would trust the change that I want to bring about in a worship service, because that's my specific area of leading worship. But like I said, that takes time. That took 4 years to get there. I can't imagine how I'm going to feel at 7 years at this church. It's going to feel even better, and I hope people will trust me even more. Now, the one thing I mentioned in this video that you must have are expectations for your worship team, and I already told you to check out the worship team toolkit link down in the description below. In that, you will find the application form that I use in my own worship ministry and my worship ministry overview / code of conduct. I call it an overview because it sounds a little bit softer than code of conduct, but I give that to all my new worship team members as they want to join the team to set the expectations for them. So if you want that, it's free down in the description below. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.